In the spring of 1847, fishermen working the marshy coastline between South Carolina and Georgia began pulling up more than just nets from the Savannah River. At first, commission it was 17 bodies. 6 weeks later that number had climbed to 43. Local papers stopped publishing exact figures and started using vague terms like further casualties and continuing tragedies. What they kept from the public was far worse. Every single corpse bore the same pattern of markings, the same bruises around the neck, the same lung damage, the same signs that someone had forced their heads beneath shallow water and held them there until all movement ceased. Different plantations, different counties, different months. Yet the marks on their bodies seemed like the work of a single hand, tucked away in the basement archives of Charleston, in boxes unopened for over a century. Court records reveal something the newspapers never dared to print. Witnesses kept describing a man they could never locate, a figure spotted near the water just before a death, then vanishing without tracks, without sound, without a trace. 16 years later, in 1863, Confederate officers were still writing about this unseen killer. Different war, different uniforms, same kind of corpses. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, more than 200 white men, plantation owners, overseers, slave catchers, merchants, even a federal marshal, had died in ways that matched the same pattern. No arrest, no confession, no grave for the killer, and perhaps most disturbing of all, hundreds of enslaved people across the low country almost certainly knew who he was. Yet not one of them ever spoke his name to any authority. Before we go further into the story of the man they came to call the River Ghost, I need you to do something. If this already sounds impossible to you, hit that subscribe button. Because what follows will challenge everything you thought you knew about American history. And in the comments, let me know what state or country you're listening from right now. It helps this story reach further than the people who tried to bury it. Because this story doesn't start with a body in the river, it starts with ink on paper. On March 12, 1831, in Savannah, Georgia, a slave auction took place outside the courthouse. The air was thick with humidity. The smell of marsh mud and horse sweat mixing with the quiet panic of human beings lined up to be sold. In one crumbling ledger, now preserved in the climate-controlled vaults of the Georgia Historical Society, there's a single entry. Samuel Field, hand 23, sound constitution, no visible defects, 800. Sold to Thaddeus Claymore. To the auctioneer, Samuel was unremarkable, one of 15 people brought down from a failing Virginia tobacco farm. Just another tall young man with scars on his back and strong hands built for field work. The auctioneer, a portly man named Hutchkins, who'd been selling human beings for 15 years, mission noted Samuel's height, over 6 feet, rare for the era, and his solid frame. He checked Samuel's teeth. He took note of the old whip marks. He saw a man who had learned how not to resist. Head down, eyes lowered, body moving with that deadened mechanical obedience that came from being punished too many times. What Hutchkins didn't see, what no one there understood, was that Samuel could read, not just simple words but complex text, not just English, but Gullah, the language of the coastal enslaved, and enough Creek and Catawba to converse with indigenous people who still moved through the swamps like ghosts from an earlier world. He'd picked up these skills the way enslaved people always had to, quietly, dangerously, without permission, listening through walls to conversations no one thought he understood, studying maps left out on tables when overseers were careless, watching patrol routes, memorizing which roads the slave catchers traveled and when. Samuel had one ability that never appeared in any ledger. He could render himself invisible while seeing everything. The man who bought him that day, Thaddeus Claymore, was a third-generation rice planter. His wealth came from 4,000 acres of rice fields along a sharp bend in the Savannah River, a place he proudly called River Bend. Claymore liked to think of himself as a humane slave owner. He was educated, had attended the College of Charleston, traveled to Europe, owned books on philosophy and agriculture. He told himself he treated his people better than most. He beat them only when necessary. He allowed them to marry, encouraged families to stay together, and believed that this kindness made them more productive and less likely to run. What Claymore never understood, and what history still struggles to admit, is that you cannot make slavery humane. You can decorate the cage, soften the voice that gives the orders, but a cage is still a cage. And some men, when stripped of everything, don't break, they sharpen. Rice cultivation in the Georgia Low Country was held disguised as agriculture. The fields were rectangles of mud and standing water, controlled by a complex system of canals, levees, and wooden floodgates. Enslaved workers stood waist-deep in stagnant water under a brutal sun, planting and weeding while clouds of mosquitoes rose around them like living smoke. Malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, these weren't occasional illnesses, they were part of the job description. Records from River Bend show that about 40% of the enslaved people there died before they turned 30. When they wore out, Claymore simply bought more. Samuel arrived at Riverbend on March 15, 1831 in chains. He was marched through the main gate, past the big white house with the perfect columns, past the overseer's cottage and the stables, down to the slave quarters. Rows of rough wooden cabins behind the work buildings. He was assigned to the third gang, the lowest rank of field laborers, reserved for new arrivals and those being punished. The man in charge of the third gang was an overseer named Nathaniel Boone. Boone was known for one thing: efficiency backed by violence. He kept a braided leather whip at his belt and used it often. Work too slowly, whipped. Look up too long, whipped. Complain, whipped. For weeks Samuel did exactly what was expected of him. He woke before dawn when the horn sounded, ate his cornmeal and salt pork, moved with the others into the flooded paddies, planting seedlings, pulling weeds, standing for hours in water that rotted skin and destroyed joints. He spoke only when spoken to. Never looked an overseer in the eye, never complained. To Boone and the other white men he was nothing special. Just one more body in a sea of bodies. But while they saw a silent worker, Samuel was creating something else entirely. Every day he was building a map. He memorized the layout of Riverbend, the exact curves of the canals, where the banks were steep and where they crumbled, which fields flooded deepest, where the patrol roads cut through the trees, where the property ended and the wild swamp began. He watched the overseers, who was lazy, who drank, who left his post at the same time every day, who liked to walk alone near the canals. He learned which nights the patrols were sloppy, which dogs had weak noses, where the water was deep enough to hide a body, and shallow enough for a man who knew how to move. Samuel learned to move through Riverbend the way water moved through its ditches, quietly, invisibly, always there but never seen. And he waited. For 3 years and 4 months, he vanished into the machinery of plantation life. Owners came and went. Some enslaved people were sold or died. Others ran and were dragged back in chains. But Samuel stayed where he was, patient, watching, collecting information the way the river collected the bodies it would one day carry. Then on August 4, 1834, everything changed. The first man to die was an overseer named Horace Gaffner, and to everyone at Riverbend, it looked like a tragic, ordinary accident. On paper, his death was simple, routine, the kind of thing that happened on plantations all the time. It was harvest season, August 4, 1834. The lower rice fields near the eastern boundary of Riverbend were flooded deep, the canal banks slick with mud. Gaffner had gone out alone to inspect the drainage canals. Standard work, nothing unusual. According to the report later filed with the county sheriff, Gaffner was walking along a steep embankment when he lost his footing. He slid down the muddy slope, struck his head against one of the heavy wooden sluice gates, and landed face down in 8 inches of brown stagnant water. 2 hours later, an enslaved man named Marcus found him. Gaffner's body lay still in the canal, his skull fractured, blood mixing with river mud. The plantation physician, Dr. Thornbury, examined the corpse, wrote accidental drowning in his ledger, collected his fee, and rode away. Mission to Thaddeus Claymore, it was an ugly but explainable loss. Men fell. Men drowned. Plantations chewed through bodies like mills chewed through grain. Gaffner was buried near the property line, in the small cemetery where enslaved people and overseers were separated even in death. Claymore ordered Samuel and 5 others to dig the grave. They lowered the coffin into the ground while flies swarmed in the thick August air. No one there knew the truth. Horace Gaffner hadn't slipped. He'd been pushed, and the hands that pushed him under and held his head in the water until his last struggle stopped belonged to Samuel. 6 weeks later, another man disappeared. This time, there wasn't even a body. The second overseer was Benjamin Stokes, only 26 years old, new to rice, still learning the rhythm of the tides and fields. On the evening of September 19, 1834, Stokes walked out of the overseer's cottage to make his final rounds, lantern in one hand, pistol in the other, same as every night. He checked the quarters. He walked the paths. The sun had set. But there was just enough twilight to see shapes on the road and outlines of cabins. And then he was gone. When Stokes didn't appear for breakfast, the overseers panicked. They formed search parties, combed the fields, the woods, the canals, even dragged sections of the river. They questioned everyone, including the enslaved people who'd seen him the night before. No footprints, no discarded lantern, no torn fabric, no blood. The official conclusion: Claymore told the sheriff Stokes had probably run away. Absurd, but convenient. Others whispered about gambling debts or drunken missteps near the river. A few suspected a slave might have killed him, but with no body and no evidence, suspicion went nowhere. Riverbend hired a new overseer. Life marched on. But in the slave quarters, where stories traveled faster than patrols, people started to connect dots. Marcus remembered where he'd seen Samuel the day Gaffner died.